Hey Google, turn kettle on, please.
Sure, turning on Kogan's smart kettle.
Now we have a cup of tea.
Care means different things to different people, and so it helps us to open up a conversation about the different ways that people live their lives and the different ways that people want to live their lives.
In our research, we've been exploring how paying attention to care helps us think about futures differently.
I could never imagine Ellie being replaced with an automated system.
What role can technology play, and what role should technology play in caring for people in the future?
So what do you think about it?
Well, no, he doesn't have to vacuum.
Were you the one doing the vacuum before?
Yeah, most of it.
Yes. And they were doing it. Yes. He helped out at times. Yes. So he reckoned this is a great idea.
Yes.
Care shows us gender, class, disability, all types of intersections that are often forgotten. So care emphasizes that. It allows us to reprioritize certain values, for example, around solidarity, working together.
We're interested in the different kinds of futures that different people might want to have and how we can bring those different hopes and dreams and ambitions into dialogue with one another.
If you are having trouble following the route, press the Get Directions button.
With the Western cultures, they just put too much emphasis on being independent, and now they are trying to use technology for that. Like, they're just trying to minimize dependency on other humans. Like, you have to be sometimes, you need to be dependent on other humans.
The way that we give and that we receive care is often structured by the technologies that are available to us and how those technologies and infrastructures, in the case of a city, are designed.
In Australia, as we know, not many people cycle, and there's a number of reasons for that. One being the material infrastructure is limited. Another being the responses that you get from other motorists can be a bit aggressive and scary, intimidating sometimes.
But fundamentally, futures are uncertain, and that can make it feel like futures are something kind of over there, like they're far away and we're working towards them. The way that I think about futures is as something that's being made by the little decisions that we're making in our life every day. The decision to ride a bike can be motivated by lots of different considerations. It might be a consideration for your own well-being, which could be mental or physical. It could be considerations for the environment, or it could be straightforwardly that it's kind of fun. It can be a nice way to commute.
Care is an ethic of responsibility. It is where we take into account that whatever I do, I am responsible not just for myself, but also for the future generations as well. And this is where, beautifully, care bridges the gap between the present and the future.
If we think about the future as being made through acts of care in the present, well then what's being produced is not one future, but multiple futures. And this opens up a conversation about how we want these multiple futures to coexist together, how we want to live alongside one another, how we want to live together with other people, with plants, with animals, with nature, with the climate, with technology.
When we think about planetary futures, are we working towards a future that is sustainable?